in particular, for the full 75 years the NBA has existed, have stood up for what they thought was right. Now we're here to do that work institutionally and turn that lens to public policy in particular. So that's where we find our linkage, and our role is to take that incredible platform that we have as a result of NBA players and coaches and organizations and direct it into the public policy realm.
And I'm glad you mentioned those specific pieces of legislation, because I want to talk to you about them a little bit later. But I guess before that, walk me through how the coalition landed on those three issues of police reform, voting access, criminal justice reform. Obviously, huge aspects in the fight for social justice, at the time, at the creation of the coalition, also right now. But I could also see things like healthcare or economic empowerment as other issues that the coalition would want to address. So why those three specifically?
Number one, those were decided by the collaboration of players, team governors, coaches, and executives. Mm-hmm. And even before I walked in the door to those three issues, and was very, very pleased with that, because they're obviously issues I've worked on for a long time and that I am devoted to. But the core really is that all of them have a clear racial justice hook. And we are a league with 75% Black player cohort. So racial justice is near and dear to all of our hearts. And on those three issues in particular, it's very clear how we can make an impact, not to mention that there's been a history of advocacy on all three of those issues. Now, to any other social justice issues, you could absolutely make that same connection. You could tie it to racial justice, and you could tie it to work that somebody within the NBA family on the team side, at the league office, across the history of the league, has worked on in some way, shape, or form. It's actually one of the most exciting parts of being here, is the work manifests in so many different ways. But you have to give some scope and some shape to an agenda. And especially coming out of the summer of 2020, policing had to be on the agenda. Mm-hmm. You start talking about policing, then criminal justice reform is a natural follow-on, because you can't have one without the other. That voting rights has always been at the core of democracy. And so those three issues are our starting core. But let me be clear, beyond the umbrella of the coalition and the board of 15 that I report to, team by team and market by market, there are lots of other issues, including the two that you referenced, that folks are working on.
So I'm glad you brought up the board, because in thinking about the coalition, the first thing that came to my mind was strategy around consensus building, because the coalition, the board is made up of players, you have coaches, you have team owners such as Mickey Aronson of my beloved Miami Heat, and you have NBA commissioners on the board. And you just got to wonder, these players, these stakeholders represent a diverse set of views about the issues and the policy fights that the coalition takes on. So I'm curious as to how you decide collectively what legislation you're going after, what fights you're going to have, really how you bring everyone together in a unified voice to be the face of the NBA in achieving the policy goals that you want to.
Short version is, this is like,
it's tough.
It's not easy.
Yeah.
but it's consensus is never easy, especially in a big group. And we're a diverse community. So having 5 players as board members, 5 team governors as board members, the commissioner, the deputy commissioner, the executive director of the union, 2 head coaches, that's 15 people with 15 different perspectives who sit in different places in our corporate ecosystem and different places in our business enterprise and community.
Right.
That is challenging to manage, to be sure, as any big group is, but it's also actually one of the things that I think is a good disciplining exercise and is our strength, because anything that we do has to be a result of the dialogue and discussion that we're having with our board. They set our strategic direction. And so if we have a sense of where we see opportunity, present it to the board and say, hey, these are the things that we think we should be behind because it's the right thing to do, or these are the things that we think have some traction and might get some movement. And I think anybody who's been in this space long enough knows that you are always balancing in the decision-making process about where you put your resources between the normative and the positive, right? Like you're thinking about the art of the possible while you're also trying to envision the realm of the impossible and try to make it happen. Those things create boundaries around your conversation where you can say, if this is the world we want to see, where we reduce police use of force, where we cut officer-involved fatalities, like hopefully eliminate one day, where we have a criminal justice system that is the likes of which we've never seen before in terms of carceral impact, and where we want to make sure that we affirmatively promote everybody's right to cast a ballot. Those are really big and weighty issues, and it can be easy for them to get unwieldy. It gets really easy to talk about stuff when you talk about specific bills. As soon as you get concrete, we've got the Floyd Act pending. What does it actually say? Mm-hmm. And what does it actually propose? How does it limit use of force? How does it promote data transparency? How does it prevent bad officers who have misconduct on their record from transferring to other departments and being able to do the same thing all over again? That gives you a way into a real conversation. So every time, and I would certainly encourage anybody who's thinking about a career in public policy to look for these opportunities in the future. Anytime that you end up in the philosophical discussion, which is important, but it gets to that point of being almost meaningless because you're debating big ideas with no structure. When you bring it back to the concrete, you end up with something to really pressure test your principles against. And being able to talk about legislation that we might support has always been a good forcing function for us to be able to speak with our board about where we should go.
Right. I'm sure you get this question all the time. It definitely has had to come up, but I'm curious as to how you respond to people who say that, this is a basketball league. These people should be focusing on basketball. It shouldn't be active in the political world. How do you respond to the shut up and dribble people, if you will?
Usually I don't, because it doesn't really get much traction. I understand why you ask the question, because it gets a lot of attention, which in and of itself means that we need to be able to respond to it. But as a practical matter, when you break it down and you ask the question another way and you say, are you really putting forward the idea that because somebody has a particular job, whether it be construction, or they're a lawyer or an architect, or they're a clerk in a store, or in this case, because they are a professional basketball player, you think that they should not speak out on things that impact them, their lives, their family, and their community? Once you ask it like that, it starts to sound a little bit more ridiculous, because everything that we have promoted, learned, and been told about participatory democracy is that it gets better the more people engage. I don't know why that would not be true for athletes, just as it is true for any of the rest of us. And I think to deny athletes their agency and to suggest that they should shy away from rendering an opinion, shy away from being active, shy away from being part of their communities and our society, it just doesn't make any sense. So that's the way I generally see it. I have never seen a compelling version of that argument. It's usually just rhetoric that covers people's discomfort with what athletes are advocating for. And that's for them to reconcile. But what I do know is that we are now in a time and space where more athletes than ever have a platform that they can devote in the service of larger communal movements for justice. And that's a good thing. And the more that they, as long as they are careful with those platforms, then we are always better off for more voices in the space, and we are always better off for debating ideas. And just as the question you asked before about our internal discussions and how we do those, the public dialogue is no different.
Right. And just going back now to those specific pieces of legislation that you brought up, and I'm happy you did. So you mentioned the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and the Equal Act. Obviously touch on the core issues of policing reform, criminal justice reform, and voting access. But as you said, it seems as if the Equal Act is really the only one there that is going to have some movement, hopefully, in the Senate and actually make it across the finish line. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what happened with the other two bills? Why do you think they couldn't make it across the finish line? And what is the coalition doing in the next couple of months to keep that pressure on to hopefully move the legislation forward?
The numbers in our Senate are so close that everything that's going to move, virtually everything, requires a filibuster-proof majority. And that's
Right.
just a real problem. At the end of the day, when that's your threshold and you got to get 60 votes, that is really hard to do. You can get into a debate about the norms of democracy and the purpose of the Senate versus the House and the people's house versus the sauce that cools the tea. Putting all of that aside, the reality is very few bills are going to get any traction. That doesn't mean that we don't fight for them. That doesn't mean that we don't try to catch lightning in a bottle. And over the course of last summer, it looked like the Floyd Act had some good traction, but as soon as we get close to any election cycle, as soon as we headed into 2022, things shifted. And that is both really disappointing and also one of those things that you have to anticipate and be prepared for as an advocate in the legislative space. Because so many of these fights are not about one cycle, they're about 3, 4, 5, 7 cycles. And making sure that whatever issue you are pushing, it is shaped appropriately in the legislative process to give it a shot at passing, that it has the right kind of public support, that it has the right kind of sponsorship internally, that it has the right kind of provisions that actually get you what you need. Because the worst thing that can happen is that your legislation gets sanded down and sanded down and sanded down until it is virtually meaningless and then it passes. So those are the things that you're always trying to balance, but we all know that. And so we're always looking for those opportunities in the federal space. What I will say is most important to me and where we are turning our focus as a coalition is state and local.
Right.
Because federal ultimately gets so much of the attention, but it doesn't have the same resonance and daily impact as state and local advocacy oftentimes can. It is huge and it is powerful when it moves, but the state and local work exists. We've got 400 odd bills on policing that have been pending the past couple of years on all different elements of policing reform across states. That matters because most of policing, it's an inherently local function. And the oversight, the funding, and the policy controls are almost all imposed at a state or local level. Federal government, as you know, has the hooks that it could use to leverage influence, and that can be really powerful. But the day-to-day stuff, the stuff that's really going to impact people's lives, is oftentimes right in your backyard. So being able to focus on that in criminal justice, in policing, and in voting is really, really important. And it also dovetails with a lot of work that NBA teams and individual players, coaches, governors, and leadership have done in their markets. So when you put them together, you have an architecture of the federal and you try to move those big tectonic plates where it makes sense, but you also keep a keen sense of what's happening at a state and local level and where there's opportunity. Those things move, and they tend to move much more regularly. And so you want to keep your options open, and we certainly are, and making sure that we want to weigh in where it makes sense on a state and local advocacy agenda.
So I'm sure at this point, many players want to be involved in advocacy. Many new players, perhaps even rookies who come into the league, want to join, want to understand these issues. So how does the coalition provide education and training for players that are interested in advocacy? And then specifically, how do you work with players to really understand the nitty-gritty, that policy wonkness of legislation and issues that come up, so that they can speak on these issues, so that they could speak to members of Congress on behalf of the NBA and its advocacy work?
I would say, we just do it. Whatever means we can use to get information to players, to coaches, to front office staff, to whomever asks within the NBA community, we do. And so that can be anything from working up a deep dive on prison reform to giving a top line on voting access to thinking about housing insecurity, which is not one of our core issues, but somebody may be interested in and want to know. We'll do that research and we'll send it out to them in whatever format is most readily accessible or that they request. So we try to be a resource in that way as players and so many more across the community are on their learning journey. And I think we all need to be on that learning journey. We all need to be figuring out how we learn more and get more comfortable with raising our voices and what that looks like It's actually not that complicated when you break the pieces down, but the barrier to entry can be pretty high because people say, maybe you have to be a lawyer to be able to do this work.